So my talk is Thinky games are emotional experiences, and designing with those emotions in mind will help you build better games. And I guess it makes sense, because I don't have that much time, I guess it makes sense to jump right in and to talk about what my aim is for this presentation, and what I'm trying to achieve and why. So I'll start, because I find it helpful to revisit what games are exactly, because I think sometimes we lose track of what they are. So I'm paraphrasing a quote about games here from The Art of Game Design, that when we make games, what we're wanting to do is create an experience for someone, but we're not able to craft that experience directly. So instead we craft the thing that makes someone have that experience. And the interesting problem is that that these feelings are subjective. So if I play a game and someone else plays a game, then we both have different experiences and different opinions of that game. And so we're kind of crafting, when we do game design, we're crafting these clunky tools to make people have these experiences. And that's why this is quite a fun topic to talk about, because lots of people can have different opinions that are all valid. So it is quite likely that you'll disagree with something that I'm going to say, and that's fine, because I'll be around in the Discord afterwards to talk a little bit more. But if this is what games are, then Thinky games are no different. And I think there's a bit of a trap that at least I've fallen into, that Thinky games are logical. So it's easy to focus on kind of the logical construction that you're building rather than the player motivation. But the player motivation is, of course, still very important to designing your experience. So we shouldn't lose track of that. And I think this can be a problem, or the fallacy is when you consider it, yes, your kind of thinking mechanics as unemotional or not important. So telling a narrative, for example, alongside some sort of puzzle without thinking about how the puzzle might interact with that experience. And a final thing is decision paralysis. So if everything is fun, then it becomes very difficult to decide what mechanic to include in your game. So I think creating a vocabulary for the effects that these mechanics have is really important to intentionally design our experience. And so this is why I say that thinking about the experiences will make you a better game designer and the impact that they're having. So now we've agreed on the point of the presentation, let's go into the specifics. So I think I start with puzzles, because the Thinky Games website, I think, talks about aha moments, which feels very puzzly. It's also, the definition I'm going to use is a very broad definition, so it will cover maybe all of the presentation if I run out of time. So let's start. So in my definition of a puzzle, we have a setup where we're given incomplete information, and the player has to work out the missing part that's relevant. And the puzzle acts as a kind of test of whether you've understood that information or not. So that's really useful. That's really useful for a game designer, because they know that the player has understood something. And it also means that they're likely to remember it, as opposed to if you just give a player like a long wall of text and expect them to read it. We know that they don't. So some like concrete examples would be, like, I've broadly created these two. These are the two that came to mind, but they're certainly not, they are more of a Venn diagram, I think, than like non-overlapping. So there are spatial puzzles where you maybe start at one end and you end at another, Portal, for example, or Braid. But there's also space filling ones, like I think Snakebird and Stephen's sausage roll, where you have to bake the sausage on all sides. And I'm also thinking these like physical wooden puzzles that you buy at like the Christmas market. And then there's more detective games that like Outer Wilds and Her Story, and kind of the classic whodunit. And I think crosswords somehow lie in the middle of, like, you need to work out the words that fill in the space, and there's a spatial restriction, but also there's a hint. So yeah, that's why I don't think they're quite non-intersecting. And I'm going to present these two categories kind of together. I think there's important differences between them, but I think there could be interesting overlaps. So that's kind of why I'm broadly considering them together. So since this is a presentation about the emotions that Thinky games produce, let's talk about that. So the prerequisite is trust. A puzzle, you're normally confronted with what looks like something impossible, and you have to believe that it's not, and that the designer has made the puzzle fair. And if you sabotage this, then you kind of lose the player. Like, this isn't something that the puzzle generates. This is something that you need to curate and that you cannot sabotage. The reward is often the highlight, right? This is the moment where you have that revelation where the impossible suddenly seems possible and everything shifts. And this is, it's this overcoming adversity, not just from the player character side, but actually your side, that I think also makes it feel very powerful. And this results in increased confidence and motivation in overcoming the next one, because you've just proven that you can do it. And then the motivation, there's this, I don't think it's just kind of like, am I clever enough to do it? Because I think you get bored after a while, but there's broader curiosity about the world. Like, how much work the player is willing to do depends on whether they think it's worth it, whether they think the information they're going to get out is interesting enough. And so I think this also kind of loops back round. Oops, something went wrong. That the aha moment can also create more curiosity to navigate the world. As a side note, you often find that puzzle games have this kind of mysterious narrative, so that even if the puzzle doesn't create this curiosity, I think the environment kind of creates it a bit. So in mechanical puzzles, how can the aha moment kind of create more curiosity? And I think it's if the reveal says something meaningful about the game world to the player. And meaningful is a vague word because it can mean a lot of things, but I think a very concrete example is when it empowers the player for the next puzzle. So Portal is a really good example of that, where as you navigate the puzzles, you start to interact with the world in a more sophisticated way. And this creates a really interesting player journey, because you start kind of in this strange world and you don't know what to do, to ending up mastering the world. And that's a very compelling emotional experience. You're not maybe leveling up in the traditional way, but you're leveling up through your understanding of the world and your interactions with it. And so when it falls flat, I've given an example from Braid, because Braid is otherwise a really, it is a really good puzzle game. Like, who am I to critique Braid? But this puzzle in particular falls very flat. This puzzle where you create a clone and an enemy bounces off your clone, and then you bounce off the clone of the enemy in order to reach a high place. And I think part of that is not just that it feels a bit like a trick, so it does betray the trust a bit. I think it's also that it's not useful. You know, if this was used elsewhere, I think people would remember this more positively, but it is literally by itself and it has no consequence outside of this puzzle to the rest of the game. And so it doesn't kind of play into that player journey, I think. I think informational puzzles in this regard are kind of more obvious in how they can curate puzzles. The reveal of the puzzle can create more, or stoke more curiosity, because often they're very narrative based. So there's a lot more character development. And if a character kind of, you get to see behind the facade, and you get to see that they're more complex, I think that makes for a more compelling story. I think also revealing assumptions about the world that were false that you had, and then thinking about the kind of consequences of that is also very compelling. So I think this one's a bit more clear. I wanted to talk a bit about organizing your puzzles for the emotional journey, because we've talked about the impact of puzzles. And I think you can then, I would say that, you know, the more impactful, you can make more impactful puzzles by making the puzzle overcome more assumptions. But then that also makes the puzzles more difficult. And so you get a more intense reveal. But I don't think you always want to go for like the most intense reveal for every puzzle all the way through. Otherwise, you'd be quite exhausted. And also, if we have this player journey of being more empowered as you go through the game, then it makes sense to have moments where the player can demonstrate, oh, I understand this. This is easy because I did this 3 puzzles back. So to have these like dips and then these intense moments interspersed with easy puzzles, I think makes a lot more sense. And the difficulty of a puzzle doesn't stand by itself. Like you can also use misdirection by how you arrange your puzzles. So in this puzzle, there's a pitfall, there's this crack on the wall to the right of Lara Croft, and she gets like 2 passes. Like I think she gets 1 pass and then it cracks further, and the second time she falls. And here she would fall to her death. But there's one puzzle where it's actually useful to deliberately crack it. And so you're kind of primed to avoid these places, but later there's then this misdirection, and you actually find it's a positive thing. And I think that's very satisfying because, again, it kind of increases this sophistication in how you see the levels, right? There's a very clear informational impact and a very clear meaning then to realizing that that thing that you thought was maybe one-dimensional or only negative is actually multifaceted. And then you can use that information going forward. So I think it's very impactful to do that. And then the really interesting question is, what do we do when the player gets stuck? So this section I don't have a lot of answers for, but I think this is where it's really difficult to design puzzle games, because you kind of pick a difficulty, right? And you know, if people find it too easy, well, hopefully something else about the game gets them to keep going. And if they find it too hard, like, I mean, what are you going to do? Like, they might just stop. So that difficulty curve, that difficulty level is really difficult. And it's something that other types of games don't necessarily have as badly. I think there's a really interesting talk about the dynamic difficulty curve of Mario, right? Mario gets harder if you run faster, but we don't have that luxury as puzzle designers. And this problem, I think, is also intensified if we design puzzle games in established puzzle subgenres. So like Sokoban or these types of block pushing games, because you have a bigger range of player, like game education, right? You might have a wide range from people who like have been playing this for years versus people who have come to it for the first time. And there's nowhere in that space that you can please everyone. Like you can't pick in the middle because you'll please no one. So the kind of smaller also your range is. Like I do wonder about, Portal is a bad example because it's such a brilliant game, but puzzles in kind of new genres or new types of puzzles, I wonder if they have an easier time in that the audience is kind of smaller in its range of game education in that space versus in a more established genre. But it's just a thought. A very obvious example for if they get stuck is just to allow them to skip the puzzle. This doesn't really have any emotional consequence. It's just to stop them avoiding. But I thought it's worth saying that I think it's become more common to like only need to do a few puzzles in order to pass an area, and then so that you can come back to those puzzles later. Maybe when you have more experience, and then the puzzle, maybe that's a way of creating a dynamic difficulty curve. I think this is easier outside of mechanical puzzles and more like in informational puzzles or detective puzzles, is that you can just keep adding information. So like Shadows of Doubt is a detective game, and as you look around the world, more and more clues converge on the guilty suspect. So if you don't get it the first time, you can look for a bit more information. While Outer Wilds, you gather information about the universe, and kind of over time, maybe you missed it the first time, but you get to keep a record of it. And then maybe after you've collected more information, you realize that something's wrong here, or what if this was like this? So I think that's very nice. And this kind of goes into hint systems. So hint systems are really hard to design in this space because I think you need to understand what the assumptions are that the player is struggling with and somehow address them without ruining the reveal. I don't know even, I've never seen it really done properly because it does ultimately, I think, rob us of wrestling with the puzzle if it's too blatant. So it's a really hard problem to solve. And while I don't have solutions, I kind of wanted to throw a few things out there in this genre, on this idea, because I couldn't quite make it work in my head. But I was thinking of murder mystery novels, because in murder mystery novels, I don't get I do have to be given the reveal ultimately, and I don't know if that's because of the setup. Like it's set up so that I'm not supposed to get the reveal, but instead, they set up an intentionally impossible situation, and I need to read to the end to figure out how they did it. But obviously, there is also a game there because you are trying to work out as you read who did it. So I couldn't quite work out. Yeah, I feel like that's related. And then the other one is a joke, because jokes are kind of like puzzles, except you're not expected to get the answer. Like I got this, I totally ripped this from Elliot Grant's talk about puzzle designs. This isn't mine. But jokes, jokes are less funny if you get it, I think. And so I wonder if there's a genre that we're missing of funny puzzle games. I mean, they do exist, I guess, like Snakebird and Steven Sausage Roll are quite funny, but yeah, there's something interesting there about like how not to ruin a puzzle, but then why do these land in the way they land? So I have like 5 minutes left, and I'll speak a bit more about automation games rather than just puzzles, because I think they are very different to puzzle games in a very crucial way, is that they have a variable difficulty curve. The problem with puzzles is that it's a fixed difficulty curve. I also like to call automation games idle games, where you decide how long you're willing to wait, which is where the variable difficulty curve comes from. If you want like something super streamlined and like spits out things really fast, then you need to work much harder than if you're willing to kind of let it take some more time. And this incremental, you kind of get this feeling of incremental progress, which I think is unusual for other Thinky type games, because this gets you to hit this kind of flow state, which is very addictive. I think we think of flow as like maybe not super emotional, but actually it's incredibly emotional. It's an incredibly intense, positive, but very tiring experience. And it's something that's quite unusual in video games, that video games can create that emotion so strongly. If you think Tetris is like the classic example for flow. Normally outside of games, you need to be very, very good at something and have worked quite hard in order to hit flow state. And what's interesting about Factorio, I think, is that I mean, I say automation games, I am thinking Factorio because it is such a classic for the genre, is that it's combined with a threat, which feels very against the point of flow, because it interrupts you, right? Like you're working on your base, you're incrementing it, and then suddenly you forgot the pollution cloud got too big, and now you have to defend yourself. And I was talking to a friend about this, who's a physiotherapist, a therapist, sorry, and studying psychology, and she was talking about ADHD and how, I'm not saying anything about diagnosing ADHD for context, but she was saying how some people's motivation are tied to dopamine, and when the dopamine drops, their concentration drops, and the shift in attention she would provide that dopamine spike that would re-engage you, which is quite interesting, because also biters are quite, not controversial, but they're very player dictated. I don't think everyone universally likes biters. In fact, I think I know both clans of people who really like it and people who don't. So something that's interesting. And I think that covers everything that I plan to talk about. So I actually do have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Caroline. There's been so much discussion in chat. and a bunch of questions have come through as well, which I will forward on to you. I've also asked Dom Camus, because he asked a question and I was reading it. I was like, I think I maybe get this, but I've asked for a bit of a elaboration on it. So if we get that, we'll ask that question as well. First off, just wanted to mention that I love the point about trust in the designer of the game at the beginning of your talk. That's a common thing that goes wrong with the game, is like you lose trust immediately, and it's hard for a designer to regain that trust. I don't know if do you have any thoughts on regaining trust in that kind of situation?
I also should give credit again to Elliot Grant, because I did watch his 30 puzzle tips for designers.
Yeah, it's a very good talk.
And I got that from him. So no, I think it's lost. I think that's the problem. It's lost, and that's
yeah, that is a problem. Okay, so we also had some questions from Plush Lola in the chat. The first question was, do you think game designers don't consider emotions enough? And maybe in particular about Thinky game designers?
I don't. I'm reluctant to say anything about other people. I can only say that I didn't in the past, and so this is quite a personal talk where I think I made bad games because I didn't think enough about the mechanics that I was bringing in. And I think I said at the start that I had this indecisiveness about what mechanics to bring in. Specifically, I wanted to make a game kind of like a love story type game, and I just couldn't. I was trying a bunch of things and nothing stuck because I couldn't quite like commit to an emotion, I think. So
yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So Plush Lola's second question was around, you were talking about being stuck in a puzzle and around whether that feeling, that emotion is necessarily a bad thing. Can't a puzzle be too hard intentionally for a unique emotional experience that a regular puzzle cannot give? Do you have thoughts on that?
I think it's difficult with Google is the problem, that there's like a threshold that most people are willing to hit, and then they'll just Google it. And once they Google it, then you're no longer someone in a game, you're someone on the couch on your phone. And so true. I do think there are people that enjoy that. I don't think it's the majority of people though.
Yeah, that question also reminds me of sometimes an experience I've had in games is you get to a puzzle and it looks scary. You get the kind of horror game feeling, like emotion from a puzzle, even though there's nothing actually, there's no gore or anything like that. It's just a scary looking puzzle. But yeah, you're right that ultimately there is a limit to how far somebody will go with a very difficult puzzle.
There is also a game, I can't remember the name annoyingly, but I know it's kind of an open world-ish puzzle game. And they tell you if it's possible, because there's a risk you might go there ahead of time before it's possible.
Yeah.
But they do make the point of telling you.
I believe that happens in Superland a bit. So in Superland, you encounter characters that tell you like this puzzle's not possible. I think there might be a few games that do that. Okay, so question from Dom, and I got an elaboration, so we'll see if we can interpret it. If we adopt this emotion-centered description of games and puzzles, how do we approach modeling the emotional responses of the subset of players who, if asked, would not agree with that model? In particular, how do we avoid apparently dismissing their claims about their own lived experience? And then the elaboration is, because I asked, do you have an example of the kind of disagreement a player might have about how you're modeling their emotional experiences? And Dom has replied, players who would claim they solve puzzles only for the technical challenge and experience no emotional response other than being happy when they win. Okay, so I guess, yeah, it's about like if your model of the emotions that the player might experience doesn't match up with what particular players might experience.
I mean, I noticed, I think I struggled with the beginning slides of this talk because I wasn't sure if I was going to get a question from someone who just disagreed with the premise of my talk. So it's not, I feel like I'm talking about a player that, like, I would, it's difficult to talk about a theoretical player because I'd like to talk to the person directly and be like, is that really your experience? Like you say it is, but what are your favorite games? Like, do you, I don't know, like, do you prefer to solve like kind of random objects detached from everything, or do you prefer it when it's contextualized? Like I just, it doesn't ring true with my experiences. I'm struggling to take that perspective seriously, but I don't know if that's fair. Like I probably need to talk to a person that feels that way and like understand that perspective, because it just doesn't, it doesn't ring true with my perspective.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting as well, because like to some degree when we design games, we're designing a game for ourselves, and in the hopes that there are other people out there that also feel a similar way about the game. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we'll leave the questions there unless anything comes through very quickly. I don't think I missed any. Oh, I wanted to quickly mention, you mentioned murder mystery books. There's a kind of subgenre that's come out of Japan. I think they're called Honkaku books. Is that correct? Somebody can correct me. But I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're like effectively murder mystery books that are intended to be solved by the person reading it. Like it's meant to be fair, so they're not concealing like the mystery or anything. So have you encountered those?
I mean, so Adventure X did an interesting talk. I can't remember the person, but she talked about how Sherlock Holmes and some of these stories from the West went to Japan and influenced the detective genre, and now they're producing like Ace Attorney games and also like obviously novels and stuff, and how they were culturally different. But I don't remember that aspect of her talk, although she said everything was logically present. But then you'd get these very weird scenarios, she said at the end, where like someone had shot a gun by dropping a tissue, and like you would have known, but like it's really convoluted.
Yeah, sometimes they are just like so convoluted that you couldn't really actually figure it out. Okay, cool. So we'll leave things there. Thank you again, Caroline. And we'll go set up for the next presentation. So see you all in a moment.